from ARUP Laboratories on the campus of the University of Utah, welcome to the LabMind podcast, where we discuss the future of diagnostic laboratory testing. I'm Dr. Brian Jackson. Today is Tuesday, June 30th, 2020. I'm pleased to have Dr. Julio Delgado on the podcast today, talking about leading a large reference lab through the early days of COVID-19. Before I get to his introduction, I'd like to just do a quick overview of today's historical context. It's been approximately 4 months since COVID-19 burst onto the American scene, and about 4 months also since the FDA first allowed clinical laboratories to start developing and performing COVID-19 tests. So during those several months, a lot has happened. Epidemiologically, we've seen huge outbreaks in Europe and the American Northeast shoot up and then come down gradually. But just as they were starting to come down, the rest of the United States started going up. And so now we've got places like Texas and Arizona, and I hate to say it, but to some degree, Utah, really needing to get this virus under control again. So that's where we are today, and we'll see where it goes. My guest today is Dr. Julio Delgado. He's the Chief Medical Officer and Director of Laboratories at ARUP and a Professor of Pathology at the University of Utah. Dr. Delgado grew up in Colombia, where he attended medical school at Universidad Industrial de Santander. Dr. Delgado later emigrated to the United States, where he did clinical pathology residency at Brigham and Women's in Boston, as well as several postdocs doing immunology research at places like Dana-Farber Institute and the CBR Institute for Biomedical Research at the Harvard Medical School. One thing that was interesting to discover recently was during that time period, he also picked up a master's degree in epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health, which seems relevant to the pandemic we're in right now. Since then, Dr. Delgado came to the University of Utah, where he's had a number of roles, including directing ARUP's HLA laboratory, directing ARUP's R&D department, and most recently being appointed as Chief Medical Officer. So, Julio, welcome to the LabMind podcast.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to just start off and ask you a little bit about what you're going through personally over the past 4 months. I mean, you had a pretty busy job before, CMO of a large laboratory and all of the stuff you do on the academic side as the division chief for clinical pathology here. So it's not like you must have had a lot of free time, but then COVID hit and I think turned things upside down. So I'm just curious what it's been like for you for the past 4 months.
Yeah, well, to say the least, it's been very interesting. But the reality is there has been a non-stop balancing act for me and for the organization, and I think for everybody in the world. I'm not going to say I'm the only one, obviously, that has been affected by this. You come to realize that there are opportunities in life that you get to ask to do what you have trained your life for. The perfect example of that. We go to medical school, we start practicing medicine in different areas, and some of us, like you and I, became pathologists. We feel like we know everything that's going to happen in the area of pathology and the area of medicine, knowing that, there might be some hiccups along the way, depending on some of the things that we face from day to day in terms of expectations and things like that a laboratory of this magnitude carries on a daily basis. But then you hit something like this and you come to the conclusion that I don't think you're ever going to be ready for something like this. Because, what happened in relation to COVID-19, I think, has taken everybody by surprise. And I'm going to have to be the first one to admit, at least, not the first, but at least in this situation, admit that took me by surprise. So obviously, we saw the cases rising in China, and then we saw a few of the neighboring countries getting some of the cases. I think it was only until we saw what was happening in Italy that we started to realize, hey, wait a second, this is real. And then within a month, we had the first cases here, and, we know everything that happened initially in terms of the preparation and all that. And fast forward 4 months and find ourselves that, we care with close to a third or maybe even more the total cases, the large majority of deaths because of this pandemic. So what has done to me personally as the CMO and Director of Laboratories for ARUP is that has kept me really with a purpose since the beginning, which I find it in some respect very, very nice and great for me, because I know that for some people, life has come to a stop. And I know that has been difficult for some people to cope with, because they have to stop what they were doing and have to basically come to a total standstill. And I know that's difficult. For me and for a lot of people here at ARUP, and I'm sure around the world, and in particular in this country, it's been the opposite. We have been working a lot more than we have ever worked in our lives. But having that purpose, I think, is so wonderful. it helped me during the initial weeks and perhaps the first month of the pandemic to be disconnected about what's happening in the world and what's happening in the United States, because I was so focused on what was going on here at RUP that I had very little time and energy to go back home and talk to people about what was going on and read on the news and things like that. I was actually doing it on purpose, not to talk about anything at home, because I wanted to spend time with my family. My kids were going to a difficult time because they started to realize, well, we're not going to have a school. I had a senior that eventually graduated, but he realized, well, I'm not going to be able to graduate and have fun. The last quarter of my senior years is when kids have fun and have all these amazing opportunities to relax and all that. Yeah, so it's just not only work, it's the toll mentally, physically that, we have gone to all of this thing, on a personal basis. I'm not sleeping as much as I should. And it's not because I don't want to. I go to bed exhausted and I fall asleep within minutes. But it's not uncommon that I wake up 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And then I remember about all the things that I didn't finish the day before and everything that I have in front of me, that it becomes so difficult to go back to bed. So I find myself working again and starting to work around 4:35. And, and it's a nonstop, every day in and out is the same thing. So I don't know, that enough of what happened. I think, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, all the listeners that I'm going to be listening to this, that, this has just been interesting and very taxing for all of us.
Yeah, it seems like it's one thing to go through an intense experience if it's a day long or even a week long, but after the weeks turn into months, turn into multiple months, it's a whole new challenge. You're not exactly someone I would consider to be a stranger to hard work or a heavy workload. I know a little bit about your past history. I know that you did pretty high-level soccer in Colombia prior to going to medical school. And, I always think that athletics has lessons to teach us that you can't easily learn in other areas of life. So I've always found that sort of thing impressive. I did want to ask you about an incident, if it's okay. As I understand it, when you were working at a hospital down in Colombia, one day you were actually kidnapped by armed rebels and taken off into the jungle to provide medical care for one of their group, which to me is just such an experience that I can't even begin to imagine how to wrap my head around something like that. I'm curious, what was that like for you? How did you get through it? Do you think that taught you anything about yourself?
That's one of my most, I'm not going to say difficult, but one of the most learning experience that I have had in my life, because it taught me a lot of things. It's a long story. I'm going to try to make it very short. But this was a year that we all professionals in medicine have to provide. It's called the social service year, which is a year that you do after graduating from medical school. This is 5 years of medical school, 1 year of internship. That's when you get the diploma. But in order to get the license to practice medicine in Colombia and perhaps going into a residency or, develop into private practice, you have to serve in a very underprivileged area where you're the only doc, and basically you are in a small setting, first level type of hospital. And then you have to basically act like the doctor of the population. And this was a population close to the home city that I grew up, like a 3.5 hour driving to a lot of mountains. So it's not that far, but it just takes a lot of time to get to the place. So it was like a population of 5,000 people, combined the people living in the urban area and people that live in the rural area. I think it was like 3 months or 4 months into my 1 year there that I was waking up and I actually live in the hospital. There was an old house that had been converted into a hospital with a lot of space and things like that. This old Hispanic home that have a lot of space in it. And so there was, adequate to have rooms and places for you to, have an office where people come in and you see them in a visit. I used to sleep in a room in the home, and then it was like late night or early morning, 1 a.m. or maybe midnight, something around that I got woken up, and I thought it was a patient that had shown up because, they will come in the middle of the night and you'll have to wake up and attend them, a woman in labor, or somebody who had, some respiratory illness, diarrhea, whatever. It was like anything that will come any given day or night. So I woke up and I was like, half asleep, and I just opened the door and I saw lots of people. And obviously, I couldn't really figure out who were they. And the first thing that really realized is that they're all males. And I said, okay, so there's a lot more people that usually come to wake me up. So usually only the nurse that comes and knocks on the door. And so I just kind of woke up immediately. And then, I can't remember exactly, but they asked me to go with them and help them with somebody who was sick. And I was like, well, where is the person? I mean, why is the person not here? Well, and they said, well, we have to take you someplace else because at that point, they still have not identified themselves. And I don't think they ever identified themselves as guerrilla fighters. I just realized because then when my eyesight became more clear, I realized that they had guns and they had rifles and they were in camouflage attire. And then it hit me. I said, okay, so this is not this is not your typical patient. I don't think I have any options. I pack a few things. I pack a bag with change of clothes, and then I put my boots on it, and then I went with them. Going by the place at the door, I mean, before I came out, I stopped by the office where I would see patient and I pick up my first aid kit and I just put it into the bag and really not realizing what I was supposed to do and what was waiting for me. And then, then we walk into the middle of nowhere for maybe 5-6 hours. And it sounded to me that we were going in circles. And then I realized that what they were trying to do was to try to avoid military patrolling that, will happen, around the area because, I mean, they were obviously trying to catch these guys, on a regular basis. It was like early in the morning, maybe 6, 7 a.m. It was already when we came to what appears to be a campsite, one of those improvised campsites. And that's when I was presented with the situation. It was a person that had suffered a gunshot in one of his legs. And so when I went to look at him and, I realized that this person had been shot maybe 5-6 days before. There was a lot of infection already taking place on the injury and on the gunshot. And, in my humbling opinion, the person was already developing what appears to be gangrene. And so, my first reaction to them was like, hey, this cannot be treated here in the field. We need to take this person back to the hospital, or not even my hospital, but a much higher level hospital. Because what I expected that this person was going to need some surgical debridement and obviously some, high-level antibiotics, intravenous, for sure, not necessarily oral, because, I mean, the infection was already taking place. So just fast forward, they look at me and they said, no, I mean, we brought you here because this is what we have you for. I mean, you're a doctor and this person is sick and we need you to cure this guy. And I'm like, what? So so it became a difficult situation initially because obviously, the expectation, right? And this is, that's when you start learning about a few things in life, what people think you can do and you can deliver. And, what you can be translated to what happened with this, obviously, this pandemic and all of that. The situation quickly evolved into having to move very often from campsite to campsite because there was military coming close, and they have people that were scouting the movements of the military patrols, and they'll come and say, we got to move. And then, I think over the next 24 hours, I want to say we moved maybe 5-6 times to different places. And then, this patient obviously was getting worse and worse and worse. And I think they finally realized that he was not going to make it. Brian, I had in my first aid kit bag, I had a couple of benzathinic penicillins, right, which is, used for strep throat. And then I have some gauzes, I have some, just basic equipment just to treat some minor injury. I had nothing that could even be considered useful for this thing. They came to a realization, I think it was the next day, noon, when they decided to basically put him down. And so they shot him. That was tough. Obviously, I was there. I mean, I turned my back. I mean, I obviously couldn't look at that. It was difficult. But I remember that is probably in my life the first instance when I felt that I had failed to somebody in medicine. Until that moment, I've been very protected, as a medical student, as an intern, and, I've been working as a doc in this small place, and everything has been so vanilla, right? I mean, easy thing that you can treat people and they come back and they feel better. Sometimes they get a little bit complicated. You have to refer them to a higher level, but no one has ever died in my hands. And I felt that this person had died in my hands. And so that was very, very difficult. The next thing was going back to where I have been taking from. And that was difficult also because it was not as easy as just to retrace your steps and going back the same way that you came from. It was about, again, trying to avoid being intercepted by military patrol. And there was a lot of radio communication. It was very difficult to understand who was talking. I mean, they intercept their own communication and things like that. I think the next day, I'm talking about maybe 48 hours since the time I started until the next day, they dropped me in a road that at the time they told me you're only like 2-3 miles away from the hospital. I didn't recognize it, and I've been traveling to those roads because I obviously have gone out to provide services to people that have called the hospital and I needed to go to those small farms and things like that. So really, it was like 20 miles away from where I was. But I was lucky that I just walked maybe a couple of miles and ran into a home. And then I knocked on the door, and then the person who opened the door had been a patient of mine. And so I told him what happened. I said, "Oh, Doc, I'm sorry. Like, he had a couple of horses, so I got on a horse, and then, we horse ride back to the place." I didn't tell a lot of people about that in the hospital and in the village because I was very worried about how the perception was going to be developed among the people because, usually that's the problem that, they expect that you don't help them, but obviously you have no option. But if you help them, and then they'll start asking, why did you help them? Are you a sympathizer of them? So, yeah, that was the aftermath, which was a little bit difficult to manage also because I get a lot of questions from the police and from the military present there that they were asking me, where are these guys? Why do you go and help them? And like, okay, so, shoot me, right? Because what do you think I was going to? Anyway, so so that's the story. And, I learned a lot of things like not having control over something, which at the time that was happening. I was the smartest person in that group of 10, 12 people, but I couldn't do anything because I was not prepared for it. And seeing a person basically dying, knowing that you're not able to do something about that in our profession is difficult and continues to be difficult for me when I think about that moment.
So do you think that was the most valuable lesson that you learned from that experience, that sometimes you don't have control and you have to be okay with that?
The lack of control has been one of the most difficult things during this pandemic because obviously, what's happening locally, what's happening at the state level, what's happening nationally, what's happening in the world, it all has an effect on a place like ARUP and in our whole life because we're not able to do what we know how to do, how we have done in the past, because we depend so much on what's happening in the world. A simple thing like a swab, right? We go back to the first week or two of this thing, there was no swabs available. We couldn't do testing. It's not because we didn't have the instrument, we didn't have the test, we didn't have swabs. And, everything has developed after that. It's been the same thing. The thing about managing frustration and dealing with failure is also something that has been very important during this time of this pandemic. You cannot beat yourself. There are things that you're not going to be able to control, that it will frustrate you and you feel like you're failing. But you have to quickly recognize that there are things that you're not able to control. And the best thing you can do is to make decisions with the best information that you have. Trust your instinct, trust the people that you're working with, and realize that you're going to make mistakes, right? Which we have made. We all have made mistakes in this thing. And then quickly identify those mistakes, be humble about that, and quickly correct and readapt to what is needed to be done so you can correct the mistake that you made by making that decision. So, I think those are valuable lessons that you learn in life that you can positively apply in situations like this. But it's different, obviously, for everybody, and every circumstance is different.
Thanks for being willing to share that experience. It's hard for someone who hasn't been through something like that to wrap our heads around, but it just sounded like such a formative as well as traumatic experience. I was interested in asking you about it. So I'm wondering if the past 4 months of COVID have caused you to reflect at all on your personal characteristics and what you see as the strengths that you bring to this position.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that people need to do in life is to understand what are your strengths, but also what are your weaknesses. And for the strengths, obviously, leverage them for the job that you are doing. And in terms of the weaknesses, try to work on them so they don't become an obstacle for your job. When I see myself, when I recognize myself, I'm a person who is a quick thinker. I'm very good at a situation where there is problems. And I'm very instinctive about how I do things. But one thing that I have to change during this time is that I have to be more careful about that because, decision has to be, at the end of the day, in situations like this, really be based on information. And because otherwise, you're going to become a person that is going to create problems for the organization, for the people that you're leading. Which leads me to that idea that we leaders need to recognize the importance of how much we influence people and how much we can influence an organization or, a whole state, a whole country, depending on, obviously, the level that we are playing a role. How it's important, and I think I mentioned a little bit about this, how it's important to make decisions based on data, based on evidence, and trust the data to the level that has been presented to you based on what is known at the time, but also be able to adjust when something is presented to you in a different way. Sometimes we run into this problem that we think of ourselves so much that it's difficult for us to accept that we have made a mistake. And that's when you get in trouble because, that kind of arrogance is what sometimes doesn't allow you to do the right thing. So being able to quickly assess what you have done and with additional information, being able to correct the thing that you have done and guide the organization or guide the people wherever you think they need to go now. The other thing that I'm good at it, and I think I've shown during my tenure at ARP, is that I like to talk to people. I like to spend time with them. During this time of pandemic, one of the difficult things that I have struggled with is we tell people to work from home because we want them to be safe. But I think for a leader, that's a very difficult thing to do because one of the things that I feel is that I'm asking 4,000 people in this organization to do things that are necessary to do. And for half of them, or even more, that requires them to be present here at work because, they need to receive the samples, process the samples, test the samples, report the samples. That's not possible to do from home. And, the people who clean our places, to keep us safe and everything, they have to come. So that idea that a leader will stay at home and kind of protect himself at home is not what I think is the right thing to do. So I have done everything in my power to be here every single day since we started here. I think I've taken maybe 10 days off total during this time because that's my way to thank them. To me, being here, walking to the labs, saying hi to them, making me feel that I'm exposing myself exactly to the same risk that they're exposing themselves, I think has been very important. And I think it's very important for the leader. That comes natural to me, so it hasn't been difficult for me to do that. It goes to that idea that you have to lead by example. You should never ask somebody to do something that you're not willing to do because that's how you need to lead.
Yeah, I love that you brought that example up. It seems like I hear a lot of people talking about, what are we learning from COVID about working and what are we learning about the future of work? It seems like people are saying, well, we don't need to be in the office. We can be remote. And I recognize there's some truth to that. And especially if you're a global or distributed company, learning how to work better remotely is important. But it seems like those conversations miss out on the value of physical presence. So switching gears a little bit here, one of the challenging and frustrating aspects of this pandemic for those of us in the laboratory industry has been the extent to which non-traditional players have tried to get into testing. So in some cases, these are manufacturers that had never developed clinical laboratory tests in the past. And suddenly here they are coming onto the market saying we've got the latest and greatest tests, but none of us have ever heard of these companies and we don't know whether to trust their products. In some cases, it's doctors' offices or other settings popping up and saying, hey, we can do lab testing. But again, those of us in the industry who know what's involved in creating high quality testing, we've been worrying a little bit. So I'm wondering from your position as a lab director of a well-established lab with a long history of high-quality processes, what's it been like for you to see all of this going on? Have you been worried about it? Has it made you upset? What have your thoughts been?
I have to admit that it's been hard, and especially initially when I was in this situation where, I was seeing and hearing what these newcomers and wannabe in the industry of laboratory testing were trying to do. And you get affected by that, not necessarily because of what you think, is because of what people around you are telling you. Because everybody in our organization, and for that matter, in every laboratory organization that have been doing this for decades, and we know how to do this, and we have done it well in the past. And it's difficult to hear that people are trying to circumvent years of experience and trying to, in the name of disrupting and trying to be innovative, trying to do things in such a different way, but not necessarily in a way that is leading to a good product, in this case, an accurate result. Initially, I think we were all playing that game of trying to compare ourselves and trying to prove ourselves to these newcomers, companies that are very, very good, led by people who are very smart, that they see an opportunity to provide some of the elements that they have proven to be good in other industries, but they have this kind of arrogance approach in which they try to do things in such a way that they think is going to be totally different and it's going to be great or even better to how it's been done. And I think the mistake is that they do not surround themselves of people who have done the thing that we have done. And, now we're hearing and now we're seeing they're being shown what they are. I mean, they are people who don't think about the details. They think about the so-called big picture, but it's really about the small details. It's about how you're going to collect the sample, how you're going to keep it stable until it comes to the lab. How are you going to do the testing? What kind of instruments are you going to do? What are the rules that you need to follow to be sure that the instrument is going to produce accurate information? How are you going to report? How soon? Who do you report to? And all of those things that needs to be taken into consideration. The quality control that has to go with every run that you do. Thing that people take for granted is so difficult to replicate and to learn in 2-3 months. And what is sad about this, in my mind, is that when all of this happens, and we might be talking about what was COVID-19, how bad it was, and how well we responded, and how better we are at that moment. You're not going to see them. They're not going to be here. They're not going to be doing the testing that we're going to keep doing for everything else that we do on a daily basis. All those thousands of specimens that come to our laboratories or come to every laboratory that needs to be tested for the thing that people need outside of COVID-19. They'll be doing something else. They'll be trying to be disrupting something else, trying to cash in on the next opportunity. And they'll be forgotten. But what they have done and the pain and maybe the problem that they have caused to some of the people that have been affected by those test results will not be forgotten by those people. I think that's the part that is difficult to understand. It's been difficult for me to understand. There was one day when I woke up and I said to my people and I said to myself, let's not worry about them anymore. Let's worry about what we do. Let's keep doing what we have done for decades because we're going to be needed to continue doing this 6 months from now, 1 year from now, the next pandemic, the next healthcare crisis. And if we lose track of that, then we're going to be in trouble. Everybody else that think that they can do this, do it on their own way, and let the people who believe on that deal with the consequences. And let's focus on ourselves, and let's focus on our people.
That sounds like great advice for the organization, and I really respect that message. I'm not going to quite let it drop, though, because I do want to ask a follow-up question. When I think about medical care, if I need surgery, I'm going to go to someone that has a lot of training and experience in that particular type of surgery, because I'm not going to risk my body to some kid down the street who's a software developer who says, oh yeah, I read a book on this and I figured out how to do the surgery. I mean, that sounds like an absurd example. And yet we've got folks out there with no lab industry experience who may have a background in something like, let's just say, software development, who suddenly think they can figure this out. I mean, we saw this with Theranos a few years ago. And we saw how that turned out. But with COVID-19, folks started coming out of the woodwork again and saying, hey, we can run lab tests. It just makes me wonder, what is it that the public doesn't understand about lab testing? And why haven't we been able to help the public understand that lab testing is actually really complex? It takes a lot of engineering and a lot of science, and you can't short circuit that. Any ideas?
I think we clinical laboratorians, pathologists, people who are involved in this industry of laboratory testing, we're good at developing testing, developing the safeguards to make sure that we are producing accurate results. We're good at talking among ourselves, talking among physicians, talking among clinical laboratorians, but we are not good at talking to the layperson. And we're not good marketers. I mean, we lack that capacity that these individuals have to sell smoke and to be able to package the smoke and sell it as a product. Because they're good at that. And, I'm not saying that they're all like that. I mean, I think there are people who are very, very good at not only at what they do, but also how they market it. And they're true, valid, and amazing products. But I think that's what I think they have ahead of us. They have this ability to come and to develop a message to that audience that is hungry of being tested by something that is simpler, right? In this case of antibody testing, just to give an example, who wouldn't want to be tested using just a small prick of your finger and get a drop of blood? But what people don't understand is that that itself is a problem from the point of view of a quantity that you're going to be able to measure and the ability that you're going to be able to measure the amount of analyte that you want to be testing for. And so I think we lack that, and I think it's upon us to correct that. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to be able to describe things better for people who are the customers, which are the people who are going to be tested by these different ways to these different pathogens that are appearing on a daily basis or on a yearly basis. And all these new diseases that have been discovered for which there is testing now available. I think we're going to have to do a much better job to communicate with them about, how is it that we do it and why it's important to do it the way we're telling people that needs to be done.
Yeah, it feels to me like it's a problem that's way beyond the lab industry. I mean, you look at something like, say, climate change, and it's really tough for non-scientists in the population to really sort of grasp what some of the complicated issues are. And it leads to a lot of skepticism, and frankly, it leads to bad politics in some cases. But going back to your point about, we in the lab industry really aren't trained in public communication. I want to follow up on that because it seems like in the last few months, you've spent an enormous amount of time on public communication, and you've probably talked to more reporters in the last 4 months than maybe your entire career up to that point. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I have had my share of conference interviews, both TV, radio, printed media. Handful of those here in the United States. I think I've done 3-4 times more of those in Spanish for Colombia, for a lot of countries in Latin America, and even stations that are here in the United States, which are Spanish-speaking stations. It's different from me when I do it in Spanish than when I do them in English. I'm very, very aware of my accent, and I'm very aware about sometimes that I'm not able to express the things that I want to say the way that I really wanted them to sound. When I talk in Spanish, Brian, about something, I might have 5-10 different ways to say it because, that's my mother language. English being my second language, I'm not totally fluid on it. And, I might have only 2 ways to say it, one of which might not be politically correct. So sometimes that's the one that comes out. And so that has been the difficult thing, obviously, because one of the hardest things for a scientist or for a person like us, a pathologist, is that we want to talk about the truth and the things that we want to convey. But sometimes the truth can be difficult for people to hear. And now with this amazing phenomena of happening, with social media, that everything you say is being dissected, scrutinized in such a way, you actually become fearful of saying anything because you're exposing yourself to one side of the spectrum that are going to say, oh, no, this guy said this because this is what his interest in it. And if you say it the other way, then there's going to be the other side of the spectrum saying, oh, no, this is what this guy want to say. So on top of not feeling 100% comfortable when I talk in English to the media, this idea that you have to think before you talk is, at least personally, is difficult for me. I'm not made of that, as you know, and some of the listeners that know me, I'm a straight shooter, and but in this time that has been difficult, and I got myself into a little bit of trouble because of that. But usually when I say something, I mean it, and I don't regret it. But it's a different role for which you never train, and so I've been learning on the job, as people say.
I think you're underselling your communication skills, but I will say I loved your Telemundo interview, and I learned a new word for my vocabulary, which is anticuerpos.
Anticuerpos, yes.
Valuable word to know in the COVID era. So to close out our interview, I'd just like to get some closing thoughts on science and academic medicine. You've been in academic medicine your entire career. One thing that has been interesting to me and worrisome to me about the COVID epidemic is that on one hand, okay, I'm just going to come out and say that the United States is the global leader in life sciences and life sciences research. And I hope that doesn't sound American-centric, too arrogant, but look at your own career. I mean, when you finished medical school and your medical training, where did you go to advance your career? You went to Boston. You went to the Harvard system. I'm assuming that was because it's as much of a center for biomedical research and immunology as any place. Is that fair? Was that your decision process?
Well, you're not going to believe the reason why I end up in Boston. That's another story, and I promise I'm going to make this very short. When I was in medical school and I was doing my pathology semester, because in pathology we spent a whole semester reading the Robbins textbook from cover to cover. I became fascinated with what we call in Colombia the CPCs, the Clinical Pathology Conferences. There is this journal that we all in medicine know, the New England Journal of Medicine, which had this section, which is, I believe, is called the case records of the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is basically a CPC that takes place every week, and they summarize the case and they print it on the journal. Back in the late 80s, when I was in Colombia, and I had access to those New England Journal of Medicine about a year after they had been published, because that's how we used to get the journals back in Colombia that late. It was religious. Every week, I'll go to the library and I will read that CPC. And I don't know if you remember, Brian, there was a little photo above the title. It was a very historical photo of the first Massachusetts General Hospital building. I associated that journal, that article, and that photo with something that I wanted to know. So I wanted to go to the place where that little photo existed. I wasn't thinking about Harvard. The New England Journal, that case, that detective work that I used to see in that, which fascinated me, how somebody died of something. And so it was funny because during medical school, there was a problem, there was a strike, and people were not getting paid. And because of that, there was violence, there was some rioting. And so the School of Medicine decided to cancel the semester. So we were sent home, and we had like 2-3 months of doing nothing. And so I said, what am I going to do now? I mean, I'm going to waste my time. So I asked my mom, can I borrow some money? I want to go to Boston. I have some money that I have saved for my expenses. So I took a plane, flew from Colombia to Boston. I landed in Boston, and, immediately I fell in love with the city and, walked to, the Charles River and all that. And I went to the place where these conferences take place on a Wednesday. They take place every Wednesday at noon. And I saw this amazing environment of teaching where these very prestigious doctors who were presenting these cases, and you had the pathologists, and you have the people talking about the lab results, and the students there, like 60, 70 students asking questions and being taught by these amazing people. And I looked around myself. I mean, at the time, I didn't understand much of what they were saying because my English was very bad. But I said, man, I want to come here. And then so I still have 4 years to go to my medical education because I still have to do my 4th year internship and the social service year. But it became an obsession for me to come back to Boston. And that's how I ended up in Boston. And then obviously, I took advantage of everything that I learned in Boston and all the opportunities and the exposure that I got there to know people and to learn things that obviously were not possible to be learned back in Colombia at the time.
Well, I love the serendipity in that, how you sort of stumbled into this. But you also point out that once you got there, you recognized this amazing tradition of academic medicine. And it really is an amazing tradition there, in Boston and in the Northeast. Again, to close out the interview, I'd just like to get some of your closing thoughts, particularly on your experience as an immigrant coming to this country to pursue your academic medical career.
Yeah, I think that the biggest concern that I have right now is that we are going in the wrong direction, because I agree with you, Brian. I came to this country now just to instill a little bit of politics on this thing. We're talking about the dreamers, right? The definition of a dreamer is a kid that was born here from a couple immigrants that came here, and now they're going through the process of what do we do with those kids that were born here, but their parents never became legally residents or citizens of the United States. I think I'm also a dreamer. I'm a dreamer like hundreds of thousands of individuals that came from a country like Colombia, like every part in the world, that came with a dream to do something in this country that we couldn't do in our country because we didn't have the resources, and we were able to do it here. And some of us decided to stay here. When I think about my life, I think I've given up 99% of everything that I've done in my life. I've given it back to this country. I mean, I still do a few things for Colombia, but that is minute compared to everything that I do for this country, in terms of my scientific advances, the thing that I published, the work that I do for ARUP as a professor at the university and things like that. I'm terrified about what I see, that, the United States is going to cut that ability to be fed by this group of immigrants. When you go to Harvard, when you go to Stanford, when you go to these premier places, you don't have to look too much to realize that more than half of the people are immigrants. People were here in this country doing amazing work. They're falling in love with this country like I fell in love with this country. And I see that we're going to be missing a lot of that material that is not going to be able to come because of political reasons or decisions that I cannot understand. I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I have. We're going to start talking among ourselves, and we're not going to have that ability to bring people that come from different backgrounds, from different experiences, who are going to continue helping us to investigate, to try to discover better ways to live. Because if we end up just really homogeneous, like somebody might want to happen in the future of this country, we're not going to be that country that we have been for so long. we're going to lose that opportunity to be the leaders, not only within this country, but within the world, because we're not going to be able to understand what's needed in the world.
It's such a valuable message, and thank you so much for closing on that note, because I absolutely agree with that. Dr. Julio Delgado, thank you so much for being on the LabMind podcast today.
Thank you, Brian. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the LabMind podcast, sponsored by ARUP Laboratories. ARUP is a not-for-profit enterprise of the University of Utah and its Department of Pathology. You can find more LabMind podcasts at arup.utah.edu or subscribe to LabMind using iTunes or your favorite podcast app.